Hello, everyone. Welcome back. In this episode, I am joined by food scientist Ryan Scannell to explore the topic of cheese. What's the science of cheese? If you ever wondered, what do I know about cheese? This episode might be an interesting one for you. In fact, we go into the science of cheese, we talk a lot of chemistry, we talk background, some history. As always, if you enjoy the conversation, make sure to subscribe, share, like, and comment. If you ever want to know more about cheese, well, get ready. There's a lot coming. But yeah, so we have something in common, and that's, I don't know, maybe I have more in common with my mom than you do with me. But my grandfather owned a dairy for, I don't know, a decade or more, and that's really where he found his bliss. He's originally from San Francisco. We're from a one of those families from San Francisco, and the like Gatsby type whatevers. And so we have a lot of history, rich history in the city. By the way, if you're listening, the city refers to San Francisco if you're on the West Coast, not New York. That's an East Coast thing. So
it's not Chicago.
I never thought about referring to Chicago as the city. Like, Chicago's fantastic because it has a lot of the amplitude that you'd find like in New York, but it still feels like you're in the Midwest, which is nice. Like, it's not a far drive away,
No.
and I think you can, well, I don't want to use the word escape, but maybe I should. You can escape Chicago easier than this island, New York, or even San Francisco is a peninsula, right? And you've got bridges, or you've got to navigate this peninsula and go around in order to get out. But yeah, it's Chicago's the thing. I appreciate it. But he owned a dairy, and he left kind of his life, right? He left his life of whatever people in that, I don't know, class, I guess you could call it, how they lived, and what their concerns were. And he ended up moving to the mountains and just kind of reinventing himself out of nothing.
Yeah.
And so when you come from means, and then you intentionally reject the means because anything maybe unhappy, let's say, like, was attached to that life, and just what it did to people, how the people treated each other, how they thought about the world and others. He went up into I forget how many acres of land he had, and purchased a dairy, and he figured it out. And so he was a cattleman, right? Like, and he followed in the footsteps of his own great grandfather, who would be my great 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 grandfather, who, I mean, I guess you could call, he wasn't a cowboy. Like, he had purchased cattle, and he had driven cattle from the border, from San Diego up into Central California. So it's in the family blood, right? Like, I think they had made their wealth that way, or at least a portion of it through that. And so here he is. Instead, he's telling me, the best days of his life were when he was up working at 5 every morning, and the weather was crisp, and he's milking cows, and he's got manure under his fingernails, and like, this, painting this picture of something unpleasant for a lot of folks. Right? Who's going to want to swap for that? But there's something about it that created a peace and really gave him I think the word's bliss. So I'll go back to that, this peace and happiness that he had. What was it like for you growing up on a dairy, and what did I miss by him having sold it, and then like our family being turned in a different direction just because my mom wasn't She wasn't a dairy gal.
Well, I feel your pain because let's see, the first homestead would have been in 1849. Wisconsin
Nice.
was founded in 1848. And so over time they got 440s. And so I think that ends up being a quarter section, but it wasn't a full quarter section. It was basically four different quarters of 4 different quarter sections. And up in Wisconsin, it's gravel where we are. The glaciers came down, and if you've ever been up to Alaska, there's areas. I remember a tour guide saying, "Yeah, see those two mountains? Those used to be one rock shelf that the glacier carved out, and that's why there's a U shape. And then over time, we got out of that ice age, and then there's no more, glacier there. And it's like, oh, okay, well, you got two mountains, and all that rock had to go someplace, and it went underneath our farm. We got gravel pits that go right up to our farm. So that continues on underneath. So it's not the greatest farmland. But for a bunch of people coming from, the famine in Ireland, it's a big deal. I'm not even sure if they were able to own land because they were Catholics underneath Protestant rule. So they come here, they get their land, they start forming. Eventually you've got sons get different land, and so there's a lot of people with my same last name, Scannell, there. And but now it's really tough to make it in the agricultural world. The Industrial Revolution hits everything. You had the consolidation of different farms, and the idea of a family farm. We had 45 cows. That's now it's now a very small farm. Most farms are going we're talking the thousands, not the tens, not the hundreds, moving towards the thousands. And there's a lot of farmers, as milk prices go up and down, as we live in a very a society built on usury, and a lot of them end up falling into bad places, and some even taking their own lives. And so it's a tough place for the family farm. It's really not part of the equation, in my opinion, of American agriculture. Now there's one. I've got some cheese here because we're talking cheese. This is raw cheddar from Leclerc Family Creamery. They're very successful in doing some vertical integration. They ended up got into goats. That family. I don't know their entire history, but every time I've worked with them, they've been very pleasant. And eventually, they had other jobs. Goats was their passion. They turned that into a family business, and then they were able to pass it on to the next generation. And then built a creamery where they're doing, goat fluid milk, goat cheese, goat other things, a little craft store, not too far off of a major highway. There's also Kelly's Creamery near Eden, Wisconsin, where Highway B and Highway 45. I'm sorry, I'm getting my things mixed up. But anyway, they've been on Good Morning America. So if you go and look up Kelly's Creamery, Wisconsin, they do all the ice cream sandwiches for the EAA, which is a big deal right now. That's the Experimental Aviation Association up in Oshkosh. And, they found a way to vertically integrate. And of course, we keep on getting more and more removed as a society away from having people ever even been to a farm. How is milk, or how is the food that we buy, how is it made? And there's actually a lot of city folk that don't take the approach like your grandfather did with starting a farm. They moved into the country to escape the city, and then they're surprised, oh my gosh, this neighbor is spreading their manure, and then they complain, and
right.
So a culture clash. And we're in a society right now where the biggest landowner is probably what you got. Ted Turner and Bill Gates buying up farmland left and right. So the vertical integration that made these companies, successful to survive, it's also happening at an industrial level where, farms are either, being purchased, or if they're not purchased, it's through long-term contracts. And it is what it is. The farming that's going to happen, continue to happen, it's going to happen probably at a very local level. Your garden, your victory garden, if you live in a town that is able to raise hens, that type of stuff. It's tough for farmers. Now, what they put in the material for advertisements and stuff, they'll always make sure that they got a picture of a happy farmer and his little family. But the way things are set up is it's not set up for their success, unfortunately.
Right,
So,
right. People getting pushed out, it seems,
yeah.
and you miss. Well, I guess for farms, you miss a season or two. The consequences are dire, right? Now, for the dairy, having 45 cows, it's still more than old Bessie, right? Did you have an old Bessie?
I don't remember the names of them. My
How dare
dad
you? If you name them, it's problematic, right?
my my dad had names. I'm sure I gave them some names. It was probably we were more likely to name a kitten, and we were more likely to lose a kitten with vehicles driving around and cows. So we learn about life and death. I grew up, helping my dad, give birth to a cow. So wrap a rope around their legs, try to push with the pull with the contractions. There's a breech birth, dad having to dig in there and turn it around. And they, so you saw the life side of things. And then also, there was cases where all of a sudden you're pulling and the hoof falls off. It's like, oh, there's a dead calf in there. Now we got to get it out of there so that the cow doesn't die from toxicosis.
Yeah.
And so, learning about life and death, learning about where our stuff comes from. My dad, because we were small, and it was really, he wasn't having me milk cows before I went to school. So some places there was farm boys who were doing that. That wasn't the way I grew up. It ends up being a lot of work for a man trying to raise a family on that. And so he transitioned the farm to grass, and we did intensive rotational grazing. It's also known as New Zealand style, but you have some paddocks that are wired with permanent electrical wire. So this electrical wire, it's intermittent, and the idea is that if a cow touches it, it gets a shock and doesn't, and so it remains in a single area. In the old days, they would use barbed wire, but you can injure a cow, especially a teat, on that, and now you've got your money makers, not very good. So they, over time, they went to high tensile stainless steel wire, ran an electrical current through it, and it pulsed so that you got the shock, but you didn't end up hurting the animal. And then amongst that we had portable wire called poly wire. Poly because there's a plastic woven in, mostly plastic, but then you get a few very thin wires woven into it, and it'd still carry a charge, but you could roll it up like a rope. And so there it'd be on a reel, and you would subdivide these paddocks. And so my dad understood, based on how the quality of the grass, with the season, how tall it was, his herd. So we had 45 of a milking herd. We probably had that many of a non-milking herd as well. And so over time, you go in, to get the milk, your cows have to be giving birth.
Yeah.
And then you keep milking them, and it keeps it flowing. They keep on producing the milk. And so you need a herd for young animals that you could either, raise up into be replacement of your milking herd, or to sell them. And so that was our non-milking herd. The milking herd, and dry cows. And so there's a period of time before a cow gives birth that you want to dry them up, and then that way they are energy that they would have been, and nutrients that they would have been making into milk, they can now put into the calf,
Right.
and put into their own selves, so that they don't like deplete their own calcium in their bones to give to the calf. And so there's a lot of things to balance. The milking herd would be given a plot of land of pasture every 12 hours. And so you keep them in a fine place. First, they're going to harvest the tastiest, most nutritious grass, and then they'll go with the second, and then they'll go down to the third, and then you go and milk them. And so you take them back to the farm, you go and prepare some more pasture for them to come back to. And so when they're done milking, where you then feed them some supplemental grain. The grain is like candy to them, so it helps them go into the stanchions. You are able to close the stanchions, and then milk them without them moving around. And so to milk them, we use it's going to be like a woman's breast pump milk, if they're in the modern world, but instead you got 4 of them and they're pulsating, and it does the same motion as if you were using 2 hands and a bucket, but a lot cleaner because it's all contained.
Right.
And so then it goes into a bulk tank. You go and take your cows back out to that new plot of land, and they repeat the cycle. And we would have them sleep out there, and we have coyotes around, so whenever they give birth out there, herd instinct would kick in, and they would go and surround the calf, and
Wow.
be willing to kill any coyotes that would mess with it. And so it was a very natural way for us to raise the cattle. Our farm is mostly gravel anyway, so it's not good for a lot of other crops. It's a lot of hills that are filled with gravel that the glaciers left behind. We live in a part. We don't live too far from the Ice Age Center, which is a little center that teaches everyone in Dundee, Wisconsin, about the glaciers. So that is really how our farm has been shaped by the history of the earth. And then come down to Illinois, and there's a reason we call them flatlanders, because everything is flat. Perfect for doing just rows and rows of corn, soybeans, whatever you want to grow, which is not great for our farm. We still have the old stone walls that were built by my ancestors. There was not a piece of the property that was without a stone. And so they had to go someplace, and they built stone walls with them, like you'd see in Ireland.
Yeah.
And that was, so yeah, under the ground, there's gravel. On top of it, there's these giant rocks. We got one picture someplace. It's of the last field that was cleared. And by then they had cameras, and these giant rocks that they had to deal with.
That's amazing. I like what you said about growing up around the process and seeing life and death and all of these things. In fact, part of me is always a little irked when I'm in a supermarket and I see meat, right? Given our tradition, we are vegetarian frequently.
Okay.
So it's easier to be a vegetarian. And though I'm not necessarily a vegetarian, I think I prefer eating animal products when I have some role in the process. If I'm fishing, I want to eat the fish,
sure.
And otherwise it becomes product, right? And this is a life that, it ate, didn't do much, but it ate, and, and maybe it gave, I don't know about giving birth if you're eating the meat, right? That's a different type of cow, isn't it?
Well, you need to have both sexes in order to give birth. So there's going to be some that are in the beef world that are that are female, some set aside for breeding, others that are going to be male. The male calves from a dairy farm, they have to go someplace, so they'd be
Yeah.
sold for not very much into the beef world, where they would be raised as a beef cow. In fact, I think Angus. I think technically the rules are, and don't quote me on this, but they have to be the animals have to be 51% black and not have been used for dairy. And so you could actually have a mostly black Holstein cow that, well, probably a bull steer. And so I guess for terminology for people, a cow is a milking bovine. Bovine would be the species. The bull would be the male and would still have all of his reproductive organs intact. A steer is one where has been castrated. And so that goes and prevents the more aggressive nature, and which is dangerous. And then for, a heifer is a cow that has not given birth, has not freshened. That's the term for the first for a cow that's getting ready to give birth. And they typically don't give birth until their second year. Or is that when we breed them? It's been a while since we sold the cows 20 years ago. So 22
Well,
years
if you
ago.
breed them, I mean,
Yeah.
they at least have to be pregnant, right?
Yeah, and so that was the other thing is we didn't have a bull on the farm, so we did AI, which artificial insemination, and then have to be part of that process as well. Having this giant straw gun thing and Dad having to explain how can't go too far, because if you go too far with it, you're up one fallopian tube, and the ovarian. In cows and humans, they tend to switch. The cow is a model organism in research for human reproduction, because both give birth to one animal at a time, tend to have about a 9-month gestation period. And so a lot of time, and the same hormones and cascading and development of the ovarian follicle and the corpus luteum. A lot of times the cow is used as a model organism, but I don't recommend telling a pregnant woman that she's a cow. But as far as
I've heard it done, believe it or not, this year actually.
Oh, okay. But
yeah, the person's a unique personality, and I think that's why his wife loved him. But it was my wife and I turned to each other and go like, did he just refer to his own wife that way? What the? Anyhow.
But anyway, yeah. So with that, you don't go far enough. You don't have a good chance that because you're buying the genetics, the sperm, the semen from a company that's what they do is they go and have a set of cattle, bulls that they are got a certain set of genetics that you're buying, and it's more safe. It's safer not to have a bull around, but you have to be in the right spot, because if the ovarian follicle or the one ovary is ovulating at a time and it switches. And so if you go too far, well, now you've cut your chances to 50% and could waste, that time. You waste time and you waste the genetics that you bought.
Well, I'm glad you're using the word genetics. That's going to help us get through the AI filter and make sure that this stays PG rated.
I've used some other words, so you might have to clip those.
I think you're good. I love the fact that you're drinking a nice jar of milk too as we're doing this. Yeah. Yeah.
It is milk. Let's get after the discussion that we had.
I know
this is milk.
I wanted you on to talk about cheese, and here we are talking about bovine eugenics. And the alternative title for the podcast is bovine eugenics. But yeah, let's talk about cheese.
Okay.
So you're okay. We'll bypass the whole milk process and just get right to cheese making.
Sure.
Wisconsin is known for cheese, right? And look, cheese is fantastic, and cheese is something I'm interested in for the flavor, of course, but it also shows up in my own research Okay. Like cheese is present in Sumerian, Akkadian, Aramaic, Hebrew, all these ancient languages, even Mediterranean languages, Greek and Linear B. You've got early attestations of cheese, but what's fascinating is the Sumerian one, and because of the date of the language, it's going back more than 2,000 years prior to Jesus, right? So about 4,000 years ago or more, that it's attested in human records. Now, I don't know enough to distinguish what types of cheese they had, whether it was merely curdled milk or the curds. I mean, we make cheese in the house. We make Assyrian cheese in the house, and I think it's like farmer's cheese is what people call it. It's very basic. It's you boil the milk, you separate it, and you throw in some kind of acid, right? And
yeah, the same way you'd make ricotta.
Okay. Yeah. And it congeals, and then we use a cheesecloth to kind of make it dense and shape it, and then it turns out real nice. I mean, it's not deeply flavorful, but I like it's usable. I guess it's a utility cheese, and it's very fresh. Obviously, it's home. You're getting it as soon as it's ready. There's no lag time at the grocery store or whatever happens in between the dairy and the grocery store. Did you ever make cheese?
No, not on our farm. And not in our kitchen. In fact, when we were young, we used the pasteurizer, but as we grew older, we grew up on raw milk. And so it wasn't, I think it was mostly because of pasteurizer. It took time to clean, and sometimes if you didn't do it right, you give an off flavor to the milk. And it was like, as long as you respected the raw milk, not everyone does, but we knew the cows, they were ours. We knew that the milk tank was always cold, and we would get yelled at if we left it on the kitchen table for too long. So we learned to respect that. So yeah, we didn't make too much. I mean, when I got into cheese was when I got my job as a cheese scientist. So that was when I first really started making cheese.
That's maybe your dairy background is enough to discriminate you against the other employees and say this is our guy, right? Yep. Their hiring committee is sitting around, all comparable CVs. You go, yeah, but he was raised on a dairy. He's got a sense for it, right?
Yes. Well, I started off on their fried food division, and then I just fried cheese sticks, and then
okay.
Then they needed someone to do the cheese, and I moved into being a principal scientist on the cheese side. So, but I loved fermentation. With our last discussion, we were talking about beer. Yeah. And when I started working for this company, making the fried cheese sticks and other things, in fact, my claim to fame is, so these are cheese curds. Cheese curds are a cheese that has not been pressed into a block and is very young. And so if you were to squeeze these together, they'd all end up making cheddar cheese eventually. But they're very young. They still have their squeak. And my claim to fame is I made the first coast to coast fried cheese curd that was sold into fast food restaurants. So, and it wasn't rocket science, but I found my niche there, and I really liked the science behind how I got that to work. Got to learn more about the cheese, and I took every class I could at the Center for Dairy Research in Madison. It's a part run by the university there, but funded by the milk checkoff from the farmers. They all a portion of their check goes towards the Center for Dairy Research and milk marketing. So they have some wonderful classes, and that's how I got into being a cheese scientist.
That's wild. I mean, like, not many people can say that they're cheese scientists. And what were you saying about the idea of these cheese curds? If you press them together long enough, they're going to turn into cheddar. Like, what?
Oh, in fact, hate to say this, they vacuum packed these, so they're kind of actually all squished together right now. When you vacuum pack seal something, you end up pressing them together. But when they are making, well, let's call it cheddar. The cheddaring process is they're putting these slabs of cheese curds together. And eventually, they'll put them into molds. Put some pressure to remove the last remaining whey, the liquid. And if you put enough pressure on, you'll end up making a nice block of cheese. And so for some of them, they put a lot of pressure on. For other ones that have a more open knit, so sometimes Kobe cheese, they don't necessarily always press that very hard, or really baby Swiss. So everyone knows with Swiss cheese, you end up getting the little circles because the culture that they're using is consuming. They're consuming the citric acid and making propionic acid, something like that. I'm not a very good cheese scientist. I've been away from it for too long. They are creating basically gas, and they have the eyes there. Well, or you don't press them very close together, and you'll get the lacy Swiss, the baby Swiss, and you'll see that the openings in it, they're not circles, they're irregular, and that's actually where the pieces of curd hit together and left a little bit of spot. And they just found that this was an easy way to go and market it differently. And maybe there's some other benefits of it, but that's what the baby Swiss is that they're just not pressing it together as much.
That's wild. There's so many different types of cheeses out there on the market. Where does it start? Is what I described the kind of cheese we make at home, is that like the humanoid clone, and then you insert more specific DNA and you get Mike or Ryan or someone else? Like how does it work, to where cheese differentiates? Can we give the cow different food to produce different milk? Sort of like the way that, Kobe beef, the cows get beer and what have you.
You ever seen the Napoleon Dynamite?
Oh yeah, yeah.
He's in the FFA, and there's dairy judging clubs at the university level as well, and they're drinking it, and this tastes like the cow got into an onion patch.
Right. Yeah, that was
this one tastes like bleach, and those are legitimate things because you'd be using a cleaning agent in a dairy, and if you're not careful, you could end up getting some of that cleaning agent into the milk. And so that's probably a very legitimate test. Of course, when they go, this tastes like bleach, everyone gets freaked out, but you'd be able to catch that in your process and the different metrics that you're using. pH testing, the pH is too high. And I remember reading that they were feeding some cows orange peels. They were trying to figure out things to do with orange peels. I think the flavor industry probably found out more things to do with it, and that's probably a higher way to make more money off of orange peels. But they fed some to cows and found that the flavors were ending up in the milk. And so most of your flavor development is going to be, though, on how you make the cheese, not on the cow itself. So for the cheese that you described, that is an acid set cheese. All cheese, like most fermentation products, and like the beer that I mentioned before, it's about preservation. And so, how do you preserve? I mean, beer. There's other reasons why you drink beer, but at its core, it's preservation. And milk, if I let this sit around for too long, it's not going to taste very good. It's eventually going to get off flavors. It could make me sick.
Yeah.
It could be growing listeria in there, and now I'm at risk of dying because I didn't, respect what it is.
Right.
And so with cheese, what you're doing is you are lowering the pH, and so that's one way to preserve it. You might add salt in the process, which also adds flavor, but that also helps preserve it and keep pathogens from growing. But also, with this, I've got the raw cheddar that's not going to be pasteurized. With this Parmesan, I know it's pasteurized. And so if you have that heat process, you boil the milk. That is a pasteurization process. You're also doing some other things because you're denaturing the proteins, you're cross-linking some proteins, and that's going to affect the texture of it. And then finally, you're draining away the water phase. And so if you want to go and grow microbes, you keep the salt low, you go and keep the water activity high, and you make sure there's a lot of freely available food to eat, particularly sugar. Well, you make cheese, you create all that nice sugar, that lactose gets converted into acid. A lot of it does, and so that is no longer easily consumable by microbes. You've now created a more acid, lower pH, less likely to grow stuff. You add the salt, and you're removing some of the moisture, and so now you can preserve it longer. And many of the cultures that we use, they naturally create little bacteriocins. So these are going to be basically, they don't harm us, but they keep other microbes at bay. And so they've naturally created a bunch of molecules that are basically antibiotics that prevent other pathogens from growing. And so that's one of the things is the more you put in the cultures that you want, the less likely you get pathogens that are growing that you don't want.
And when it comes to flavoring, right? Like, why do we talked about it with beer a little bit, and regionalism and things like that? Why do certain regions, like, why do we get provolone and mozzarella from Italy, and maybe we'll get an English cheddar, or some kind of German Münster? Like, what goes into number one, how do the flavors happen? How, like, apart from what you just described, and is it just that's how they made it and they passed it on, like that was their discovery, and so that became a national sort of cheese? I don't know. I mean, or do they, is there an art and craft to, I mean, maybe I'm asking you the history of cheese making, I guess. Is there a cheese that seems to be kind of a baseline cheese that different communities will develop, or I mean, say it bring to market? But I think for most human history, and even recently, right, like, people could get by on bread and cheese because it's mobile, it's durable, you don't have to do much with it if you're working, like you're last couple hundred years, right? Like, people would take a chunk of cheese and bread, and that's how you ate food, right? So
I think part of it, so I'm not going to be able to answer all those questions, but a lot of it's going to depend on whether or not you're a mobile society, nomadic society, or set. So if you are a mobile society with goats, where you're using vessels to go and store the milk, and those vessels are probably going to be skins. It might be the first case of where they discovered how to use rennet. Rennet is an enzyme that on the milk, you have casein in there. That is one of the cheese proteins. One of the most important used for cheese making, and there are a bunch of hairs on it. You know what? Why don't I first start with just talking about how cheese is made, and start with milk?
Let's do it.
Let's do that.
Let's do it.
Because I've already started down this path.
You start into casein and whey, and then I'm going to start talking, like athletics and training and muscle, growth and things like that. So
go right ahead. I mean, so milk is a very it's designed to grow a little calf into a big cow, and we or a little kid, goat kid, or lamb from a sheep. And so with all of these, you ended up finding a way, cultures said, well, if we continue to milk these animals, they'll continue to produce milk, and that will go and convert something that we can't eat, grass, into something that we can consume. that is high in energy. So you got your fat, you've got your lactose in there, your sugars. High in protein, that's important for the development of muscles, skin, and all of our organs. And then there is also the minerals. But how do you make sure that all that stays in a fluid? Because if you ever mix oil and water together, you'll have the oil floating on the top, you'll have the water underneath, and yet you have all this, in here. Even if you don't homogenize this is homogenized. How do, if this wasn't homogenized, eventually you'd see the cream settle to the top, but it's still in a water solution. You go and buy heavy cream at a grocery store, it's still, I don't know, 50% water, more or less, depending on whether or not you're getting light or heavy. And part of that is there are these phospholipids that are around the fat globules. So phospholipids, fat is a nonpolar molecule. You go and look at it, there's going to be no charges on it, no pluses or minuses on there. Water by its nature creates a dipole, and on one side it's going to be negatively charged and the other side positively charged. And those two do not want to mix. Like with like, you want to have your polar molecules like to be with each other, your nonpolar molecules like to be with each other. Your phospholipids, they are basically both. They swing both ways. And on the one hand, they're polar, and the other hand, they got a side that's nonpolar. And so they create an interface that is energetically favorable to go and have these fat globules all together. And so that's Mother Nature finding a way to go and mix both water and fat together. Well, then the proteins. Well, your casein in here, you got basically your fat soluble and your water soluble proteins in here, and both play a role, and both are your casein is very important to help with the interface between the fat globules and the rest, and they are negatively charged. So on the outside, you have all these the casein that's able to interact with the fat globules, able to interact with the water phase. If you do homogenize, all of a sudden your fat globules get destroyed, and you have all these little small fat droplets, and your surface area of those droplets is a lot greater than your surface area for the fat globules. How do you make sure that it doesn't separate? And if you work this enough, you'll eventually separate the two. That's how you get butter.
Yeah.
But the casein is able to play a role of the emulsion. That's the word I'm looking for. They're an emulsifier, and so it's able to go and interface with the fat and the water, and that's the most important for making cheese. You want to discuss what casein is from a health benefit standpoint?
Well, I mean, I know that it as a protein that you take, it tends to be and look, I'm not going to use food science language. I'm going to use, human language. You tend to take it for a more long-term release, or like a longer, like maybe you'll take it later in the evening, so that your what's the word for processing?
You digest.
Yeah, I guess digesting, the protein sort of throughout the night and, over a longer period than if you were to take just your, I guess, regular whey protein.
Right.
When we make cheese, or even when we make yogurt, right? Like we make yogurt at home too. So we've got a layer of liquid, that's our whey, and then we've got the curds on the bottom, and that's Little Miss Muffet, right? Now, see the problem with, look, man, I'm realizing half my podcast is me growing old, because I'm talking about the good old days, and the kids don't know anything. But really, I think it's because I feel bad for what's lost, and not that they're deficient in, not that the upcoming generation is deficient in character or anything, but in experience, right? Like you talked about, you got to grow up around these experiences with the cows, and if you're not making stuff at home, if you're not canning, if you're not taking, like if you're too reliant on the market, the grocery store, and look, this is what keeps the country afloat. It keeps the countries. I mean, we import stuff from other countries all the time, our fruits or, whatever, even our canned goods. But it starts somewhere. And so where, this little Miss Muffet sat on a tuffet eating her curds and whey,
Yep.
Everyone grows up hearing that, little nursery rhyme. But what the heck are curds and whey, right? If you're not immersed in it, you're not touching it, you're not eating it.
Cottage cheese.
It's just, yeah. Cottage cheese, whatever. But like, it sounds like it's put in there to keep the rhyme going.
Yeah.
Or at least to keep the meter. I don't know if it rhymes with anything now that I think of it, but you've got this layer of liquid, you've got your whey, then you've got your curds on the bottom. And so, am I getting a protein boost? Like, is it good for me to go grind for, 90 minutes and then come in and just drink this potion that separated from the curd on the bottom that's going to be our yogurt in a day and a half?
So first of all, what is curds and whey? Curd is going to be your fat soluble phase, and your whey is going to be your water phase, and they've now separated. And the whey protein is the water soluble side. So I typically have not worked with casein. Casein is more expensive because you could use that to make cheese. Whey, which is going to be going off in the whey stream, which is at one point was the waste stream. It's now a co-product. At one point, they used to spray whey on fields for, and that would be nitrogen for the fields. And, you grow corn on after it. Then they found out that they could go and sell it to people looking to get a boost in the gym. And now they're making a lot of money. There's actually cheese factories. And I don't know, this might be hyperbole because I don't know their books. And I know the cheese that I bought from them for my job, they weren't giving it away. But there are some cheese factories that have been built where their priority is actually the whey.
Wow.
They'll still make money on the cheese, and a lot of those, there are certain types of cheese that are they're higher pH. They're not very acidic, and so then your whey isn't as acidic, which can be better for whey processing, or at least for the flavor. But so you're they then draw that off. They go and draw it off before they salt, so then you don't have that salt going in that stream either. Then they go and continue to run that through some filters and separate that whey protein from the fluid, and then they run it through some spray dryers to get the last bit of moisture out, and they'll add some flavor, and then they'll sell it and make some good money off of it. The casein, that's now less of a byproduct or a co-product, whatever term you want to use. And so casein is going to be more expensive because that could have been used to make, cheese. And, I drop this in the milk, and it's not going to go or drop it into water. It's not going to eventually dissolve, but whey protein, it eventually will. And so that's the big difference between the two different types of whey and casein. And you'll see in stores now, there's A2 milk. They found that some people are sensitive to A1 casein. That's part of the casein molecule. And they've got these, talk about eugenics, these freaks of cows that they have a mutation where they don't produce one part of the casein. They're just producing the A2 casein. And so they found, well, you know what? We can now produce a milk that is, better for these people. And maybe some people are going to think, well, if it's good for these people, why isn't it? It's got to be good for me. And so that's a higher value milk in the grocery stores, if you're ever seeing that.
It's like for lactose intolerance. Is that the
kind of
something different?
Lactose intolerance, that would be more like protein intolerance. It'd be like being gluten intolerant. You're having trouble digesting a specific protein in wheat, which would be gluten, and having an A1 casein tolerance would be similar, having trouble digesting, or maybe there's some inflammation from it, and having an A1 free milk that they call A2 milk might be better for them. Lactose intolerance, and so those are all, we're talking sensitivities. Someone might say, hey, I'm allergic to wheat, and then you find out that No, they just have a gluten intolerance. Or you might find someone might say I'm allergic to milk and they just have a lactose intolerance. Lactose intolerance just means that they lack the genetic mutation in humans to go and convert lactose as an adult into its base sugars of glucose and galactose. And so for some populations, that gene never gets turned off. It's on when you're a kid, and then for a lot of the Caucasians, and look at cultures that tend to consume milk, they will go and most likely have this mutation or trait. Maybe trait is more better. But I once worked for this guy from India, and I said, hey, India and China, they're right next to each other. And Indians, vegetarian, they'll still consume milk and cheese. I'm like, you're right next to China, and typically Chinese people are more likely to have a higher incidence of lactose intolerance. And, the Indians, they consume all this dairy products. Why is that? Why do you not have that, transfer of genetics? And he goes, have you ever heard of this small mountain range called the Himalayas? Like, oh, okay. Yeah. Okay. That makes sense. So, Indians, they tend to have this genetic trait where they can consume lactose. Caucasians generally. Then other cultures, they may be less likely to consume it. However, if you eat an old cheddar, over time, that lactose, some people, they might be lactose intolerant, not be able to drink milk. They might have trouble with ice cream because a lot of times, instead of using cane sugar, a company might use lactose in there because it's cheaper. It's a waste product from cheese making. But if you consume cheddar, there's going to be very little lactose left. And so there might be people that are lactose intolerant that can consume cheese products, but can't consume milk. Now that differs from like a milk allergy is they're having an immune response, immune reaction to the protein. And so, they can't go anywhere, near that. So that's a lot different. But anyway, so we talked about fat, water. I implied there's a lot of water in there. Casein, whey, and then there are the lactose. And so that lactose is delivered, and then there's calcium, ash, minerals, depending on what you're looking at. There's a high amount of minerals in there. Now, your minerals, that can crystallize. Your lactose, that can crystallize. And so, the mammals, cows, horses, humans, they have a way to deliver nourishment from the mother to the child so that they can consume it at a very young age and not worry about crystals forming in the teat and all of a sudden having a blockage, or lactose doing the same thing, that it all ends up in the for the child. So milk is an amazing thing. And PETA will often emphasize, oh, you're stealing something that's designed for a baby cow. It's like, well, yeah.
Yes.
Yes.
No, but you're right. Milk is a fascinating thing. Like you said earlier, it's designed to make this baby cow into a big cow, right? Like or at least to jumpstart it. And that's the case for mammalians.
Mm-hmm.
Like this milk is really transformative. And as you're talking about all the differences in cultures and the milk drinkers, the dairy consumers versus those who didn't. I heard a story once, and maybe you've heard of it. And I think it was from one of the Icelandic sagas. You know
Okay.
what I'm going to say? The Vikings land, in North America, and they encounter the Native Americans, who they call the Skraelings, and it was, I don't know, maybe it was in a documentary. I heard someone theorize that, if they offered them milk,
mm-hmm.
and everything was nice in the beginning, but then like suddenly unexplained goes to war, it could be that the native population was lactose intolerant, and thought they were getting poisoned.
Huh.
If so, I don't know. I heard something about that, and if anyone's listening and the story a little better, put it in the comment section below. I'd love to find that out and track that down a little better. But it's one of those things where, how does milk impact, human interaction and diplomacy, right?
And it's going to play a big role, as far as, probably what gets consumed. And so, a big thing that plays a role is, are you taking the cows up the Alps and then bring them back down? You'll probably have different types of cheese that are being made as you're pasturing. There's going to be, within the lactation cycle, if you live in a culture that tends to be on a seasonal cycle, here in America, we're able to feed the cows hay, grain throughout the year. So then they're also able to give birth throughout the year. So rather than having birth tend to happen in the spring, but you're going to have different quality of milk at the beginning of a lactation cycle versus at the end of a lactation cycle. That gets smoothed out if you are not on a seasonal program. If grass-fed, Kerrygold, they make a big deal about having a little tint to their cheese. That's because they're grass-fed. So that can add grassy flavors as well, that we might not have in more grain-fed cows. And then if you're nomadic, maybe that's going to play a role whether or not you have a winter, because now you're probably going to be taking some cheese, and maybe you make your Parmesan that can be aged longer, and you focus a lot on that and are able to cellar it if you're an established culture that's not nomadic. And that would be a type of cheese designed to make it last through the winter. Whereas others, they might be consuming yogurt all the time, where it's more of a fresher style and they're not aging it out. So those are some of where culture and society and geography and all interact.
Yeah, really. Like you said, even trade routes and mobility, go into how these things are made, developed, or what the trend is for eating. I mean, I heard a story once that someone theorized that, and maybe it's a folktale, that it was the Bedouin who discovered cheese because they would put the milk in their sheep bladder flask, and as they rode, it would churn the milk, and you would have these enzymes from the bladder, that separated the curds and the whey and left cheese. I mean, maybe they'll say they'll give you a picture of people riding camels and stuff, and look, if it's happening in the Middle East, the camels come a little later, so that doesn't quite work given our
Sure.
chronology with the with what we have from Sumerian and earlier documentation. But yeah, anyway,
let's talk cheese science, because that's why would having cheese in a bladder make a big deal? And so the process is, start with milk, you pasteurize it. How you pasteurize it might determine what type of cheese you're looking at. So if I am looking to grab onto a lot of moisture, I'm going to pasteurize this at a high temperature for a long time, because there are disulfide bonds. So there's sulfur, some amino acids have sulfur, and normally your whey and your casein are not going to interact very much. But if you go and pasteurize and do it at a high temperature, the heat will cause the cross-linking, and then all of a sudden you've got whey proteins that have been denatured and bound to the casein. And so you might want to do that if you're making a yogurt, if you're making a cheese that is supposed to be a little bit more runny, especially if you heat it up. And so that's one lever you can use when designing a cheese. The next part is the acid step. And so in your cheese that you make at home, you're adding external acid. Could be vinegar, could be citric acid, could be, those are probably going to be the two main ones. Or if you are, making it in a vat, you're going to add lactobacillus. You're going to add thermophiles, mesophiles, depending on what type of cheese that you're trying to make. Those are different types of cultures that have different attributes, and they're going to add different flavors to it. Some might break down the proteins a little bit more. Some might leave them more intact, and that might determine how you age things out. So that's and the big thing right now is also throughput. So if you are a big industrial company, so thermophiles would have been typically used more on the Italian cheeses. Well, let's say you make cheddar cheese in that same style. Well, your thermophiles, that means they're more active at a higher temperature. They're producing more acid. That might allow you to produce cheddar faster, but there's a trade-off that if you don't control it right, it might crumble more. It might not age out as well. Might get bitter with time. So there's depending on what type of cheese, you might be able to make a cheaper cheese by going faster, but there's going to be trade-offs down the road. And for some applications, that's perfectly all right, because if it's going on top of a pizza or something, and then you don't necessarily need a certain type of cheese for that. Then coagulation. So at that coagulation step, you might add a rennet. And so I reference the casein being negatively charged.
Mm-hmm.
And so, if you ever take two magnets and put them next to each other, they're going to be attracted. If, they're the opposites attract, but repulsion, if the magnetics, the same type. Same with electricity, electrical charges. And so that's how the casein helps keeps things dispersed, is that it's spreading out. But if you're making cheese, you're going to want to compress some of those things together. And rennet is what is coming from the intestinal linings of a young calf. And over time, those enzymes will turn off as the calf gets bigger. But that is, they're very active when it's a calf. Or you go and genetically modify a microbe. Let's say you take a gene that codes for that particular enzyme, and the one that seems to be the most stable at the moment, the most specific, so that it always cuts the same way and not being irregular with the proteins, is coming from camels. And so it's a chymosin or chymex. But they'll take that enzyme, the genetic code for it, put it into a bacteria. They will grow it on a medium, and then they will filter out that enzyme and sell it to cheese making. And so if we had to use just calf intestines, we would not have enough calf intestines to make enough cheese. We would not be able to fulfill that demand. And if you are concerned about, let's say, kosher or things like that, it's easier to have kosher chymosin coming from a recombinant microbe versus trying to because otherwise then you have to find a rennet that has been coming from a calf that has been killed in a kosher manner, and it ends up becoming a big deal. So that's one of the things when it comes to kosher cheese, and I would assume anything that's halal compliant, that might be a big deal with that. So by putting on that chymosin, it shaves the casein of those little hairs, and they do look like little hairs that have negative charges on. You shave them out, and so then the kappa casein, which gets cut off, that goes into the waste stream, and your casein molecules and your fat globules can all be pressed together without what you want to do in order to make cheese. And they've in the waste stream, the kappa casein, they think there's some growth properties to that. So they've tried to, can we refine out the kappa casein? I don't think there's a cost-effective way to do that, but there, for people that are interested in muscle building, there's been that. Lactoferrin, that is a milk, so the calves also need iron, but iron's very reactive. And so the cow has this molecule that will bind the iron so it can be delivered to the calf in a safe way. So you don't have all this oxidative stress going on inside the calf. But lactoferrin is often used as an antimicrobial and is often used in like toothpaste and other things. So that gets further refined out of the waste stream. But back to cheese. So now you have in acid cheese, you don't necessarily would have that rennet. And it sounds like with your farmer's cheese, you haven't added rennet to that, but that's something that can be done. But with an acetic cheese, it's not as necessary. But by removing that kappa casein so that you can press everything together so that it's all the same charge, you don't have to acidify as much. So you don't have to have as crumbly of a cheese. And so your protein changes shape based on the pH. So, you add, if you were to go and do that with eggs, you'll sometimes, pickle eggs and they'll become solid, and you're not cooking them and you're not boiling them. That's all from the nature denaturation, or the protein denaturation. And that's what heating, boiling eggs does. It denatures the protein as well. It's just you're doing it by acid. You cause it to change shape. And if you go too far with it, you can get crumbly and gritty and other things that you don't want in certain types of cheese. So that's the coagulation step. Is you've got it a curd at this point, and you now have to cut the curd. It's now a solid mass. And there's a few ways you can do it. If you want to get rid of a lot of moisture, you're going to cut them very fine, like the size of rice. It would be called ricing. And you would do that with a low moisture Parmesan. This isn't a true Parmesan, but it's in that same category of hard cheeses. And you're really cutting them thin, and will cook the curd. As you heat up the cheese, this curd, it becomes more hydrophobic the higher you raise the temperature. And so as you raise the temperature, it becomes hydrophobic and will help expel more water from the curd. And of course, if you want to lower moisture cheese, especially if you want to go and age it out longer, you'll cut a smaller curd and you will go and cook it at a higher temperature. Or let's say you want a higher moisture cheese. I don't know where Munster is, but Munster melts. Typically if you have more moisture in there, and I have heard from some of my Mexican friends that there was a period of time where you didn't have as many Mexican cheeses being made up in here. They would use Munster as an alternative for their quesadillas because of its melt properties.
Right.
And as an aside from a culture standpoint, here in the New World, most of our cheese, the cheese varieties that we have in America are coming from the old country. So in Mexico, you've got a lot of, I think last time I mentioned how German influence on the beer, on the brewing side. You also have a German influence on the cheese side. Parmesan, the EU hates us because we will go and call a cheese that is not made from the Parma region of Italy. We will call that Parmesan. And, I'm sorry, we had Italian immigrants come from the old country. They came here and they made the cheese that they knew, and they named it, after their home country to honor it. So, they have a legitimate reason to call it Parmesan.
Yeah.
And, cheddar comes from the English area of Cheddar, England. And so that would be what they got from that culture. And ricotta, traditional ricotta that is an acidification and a heating of the whey protein and any casein that might have escaped into the whey stream. That was a way to make value out of the whey stream before they really knew what to do with it. So traditional ricotta would be a cooking and acidifying the whey into curdles that they would still then make money off of and wouldn't have to spread it on a field. But I like myself a whole milk ricotta, so that's not going through that way. But I like I like my fatty cheeses. So they cook it. The other
That's
thing
the quote of the podcast, by the way. I like my fatty cheeses.
This is whole milk. I personally, I think it's better for you. I get fuller off of whole milk. With skim milk, I can drink a lot of that and not feel as full. Fat is there's satiety to it. So then the other thing that the cooking does is it stops the culture. So if you don't cook your cheese, it'll continue to produce acid. And so your mesophiles that I mentioned before, those are at a lower temperature. You heat them up and you deactivate them. The thermophiles, they're less affected by the temperature. They like the higher temperature. But if you got your mesophiles, maybe you're making a cheddar in the traditional style, then you deactivate your microbes, and your pH will it'll eventually go up a little bit because there's buffering capacity. But that's how you kind of control it from going too far. If you let it get too acidic, it'll get cracked and crumbly. And if you're using the yellow color annatto, which is from a seed, it'll turn it pink. So you'll sometimes find in some of the fast-made cheddars, if it looks a little pink, either it's been sitting there a while in the high, in the intense deli lights, which might be higher UV, they've oxidized the color a little bit, or maybe they have went a little bit too acidic on that cheese. But at this stage, then you'll also you'll then drain, and so you'll drain off the whey, and in there, if there's any unconverted lactose, that'll also be drained away as well, because if there's lactose there still, the microbes, if they're not fully shut off, will continue to eat it and convert it. If they are shut off, any of your contaminations that you might just say is they call it non-starter lactic acid bacteria, NSLAB. It's basically a pretty name for contamination, but you might get some unique flavors from that. Then you salt the cheese. And so for your thermophiles in your more Italian styles, they're very salt sensitive, and that will go and shut off their activity. And notice this is after the draining. So, now your whey is away, you can go and convert that into whey protein and sell that to muscle heads. And then your salt is added, and salt it's a preservative. It's flavorful. Yeah. And so there's a lot of value there. It helps draw off more moisture. And then there's the forming stage where you'll form it into maybe hoops. So Parmesan is traditionally in a circle. Cheddar is typically in slabs, and then you'll press it, and the pressure will help the curds knit together, help expel any remaining whey, and then if it is to be aged, you'll age it at a controlled temperature. Sometimes you might put it through different stages. You might actually add at one of these phases, maybe they were playing around with secondary cultures. So if you wanted certain flavors, and you weren't going to rely on the house culture that was contaminated the cheese, you would add this culture to it at a later phase. And then that would be what eats what's remaining, or break down any of the protein, and continue to make flavors. If you're making something like a brie, this would be the stage where you would put an outside culture on the outside, and so with that you put a mold, and so for pregnant women, you don't want to eat the raw cheese. Mm-hmm. There's a chance of listeria, which is an abortifactant. The toxin that it creates can result in the mother losing the child. Yeah. But also the issue is with something like a schmear ripened cheese like a brie. That mold is going to break down some of the protein and produce ammonia. And so if you walk into any of these aging cellars for brie, it just smells like ammonia in there.
Wow.
And that's because ammonia, amino acids, similar names. Those amino acids are being broken down into ammonia, and that raises the pH. And so one of your things that was helping protect the cheese by having a low pH, well, now that you're working against that and raising the pH. So that's the process in a nutshell. Yeah. Any questions?
Well, I mean, the first question is, how come we don't have how come Kobe cows aren't making Kobe, beer cheese, right? Like, that way we can combine our two podcasts together. Feed the cows beer and see what
did
kind
you
of
say
cheese.
Colby? Because there's a Colby cheese.
No, not Kobe, Kobe. Sorry, Japanese, the Kobe style
Wagyu.
Wagyu,
Yeah.
yeah, Wagyu beef. And why aren't we getting a cheese like that that's tinged with beer? Where Napoleon Dynamite says, this is clearly made by a Japanese cow. Maybe they do in Japan. I don't know. Maybe that happens.
So the different breeds of cows. So there is a company out in California. It's a cooperative called Hillmar, and so California does. I think they're the dairy state. They might even be the cheese state now. They overthrew Wisconsin a long time ago.
We had commercials, real California cheese,
Well, and happy cows come from California.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So Hillmar got their start because there was a bunch of farmers there that raised Jersey. And Jerseys are real nice cows coming from Jersey out over in Europe. And they are a real nice temperament, whereas Holsteins can be a little bit more high strung. And they produce less volume of milk, but higher solids. So higher fat, higher protein, and so that is what you would want to have for making cheese. And the cheese factories were not willing to pay them more. Whatever calculation they were doing for the milk solids and then paying them based on that was not in their favor. And so they said, well, we'll pool our resources. They started a co-op. It's now a very large cheese company. And they specialize in cheddar at many of their plants. But they, the way cooperative is set up is the farmers then get paid better, and they could pay based on solids, which the other milk factories in the area, cheese factories, were not paying them on. And if you're a cheese factory and you're buying Jersey milk, you're benefiting from that because of the higher solids. So that is one example of how different cows produce different types of milk. Holsteins produce a higher volume, and so they tend to be the dairy cow of choice in America.
Yeah,
especially for fluid milk. But they do have some of them do have an attitude to them. And then your species of animal. What's that movie? Meet the.
Oh yeah.
I'm not sure if I can say the last word.
Well, it's spelled with an O. It's a ripoff of another movie called Meeting Daddy.
I did not know that.
Yeah, I got to see the screening with the director several years back, and then I think it was a year and a half later you meet the Fockers with those other guys, but the others had the Bridges in it. Had Lloyd Bridges and Bo Bridges. I don't know if Jeff Bridges was in. I forget. It was around the time of the Big Lebowski, so I should remember something like that.
Well, it's a Ben Stein movie, and as Ben Stein says, what if you can milk a cow, you can milk a mouse. I don't know, but it's been a while. But shows milking a mouse. You can make cheese from goat milk, from sheep milk. Horse milk, you might have heard of kefir, which is a fermented liquid. So it's still liquid, but it's basically a liquid yogurt, common to the Slavic countries. Kumis is the horse milk version of that. And, there are certain, so whereas cow milk, you tend to have more casein in it than you do whey. And some of these other species, don't quote me on this, but I think with goats and with sheep and with horses, you have more whey in there than you do casein. And so those are going to be a little bit closer to human milk. And with horses, I have been told, is the closest to human milk.
Oh, well,
And I heard someplace that Serbian tennis player, I'm not even going to try to pronounce his name. He purchased like a bunch of horse milk cheese to be served at his restaurants that he owned. So
Bon
like
appetit.
like a cheesemaker's entire annual supply he just purchased.
Hey, if you're a success, why not? Why
Yeah,
not? So last thing, I think we can leave everybody with is, what advice do you have for, surviving the apocalypse when it comes to cheese? As a
sure.
food scientist, what can we do? I think probably a lot of the listeners, they don't make their own cheese or their own yogurt or things like that. But what's a good way forward for people?
Well, I mean, if you wanted to go and have cheese in your fridge, but in your pantries or cellars, let's say, uh, something that you still want it to be a little bit on the cooler side, but if you wanted to have cheese that would last a while, you'd want your lower moisture, higher salt cheeses. So Parmesan would be a good candidate. Buy that by the wheel, and you'll have the rind on the outside still, and so you could have that last a while. Your sharp cheddars, by the time, if it says sharp, it might not have been aged out to a year or so, but it was probably a cheese that was designed to be aged, and you could age that out on your own, and that would you'd probably want to keep in your fridge. But a Parmesan you could keep at outside of your fridge. I mean, they're aging it in warehouses that aren't refrigerated; they're temperature controlled. So yeah, I guess Parmesan would be my go-to cheese to go and stock a cellar with.
All right. Well, you heard it here. And listen, I know we could keep going because there's a lot of little sub conversations we could have had either with the cheese or the chemistry. But and if there's any chemistry teachers listening or watching, give this episode to your students and have them pick out the vocabulary, right? Like, you either know Greek, where things like thermophile, just like you get it,
Or the amino acid
or
tyrosine.
hydrophobic, like basic chemistry terms. And you either know the language or the field. Have them come for extra credit. But hey, man, look, this is
If I could go and put it,
yeah.
So there is a website that if they are a science teacher, or if you're just interested in the science of cheese, and cheesescience.org. They won't be posting any new content because the creator passed away. But he was very good at he did infographics. He was talented as a computer graphic design artist, and so he has put a lot of what I've said into graphic form in a way that's very educational. And if you were to go and be a science teacher and wanted to, at your home, if you wanted to teach your kids the science of making cheese, you could have them make ricotta, or maybe you're talking about Lebna or a type of cheese that is a farmer's cheese. That's actually I did that as an experiment. How does whole milk ricotta taste compared to skim milk ricotta? And there's lots of things you can do. But cheesescience.org is just a very good job at communicating the science of cheese in a very visual manner.
Awesome. Yeah, I'm definitely going to provide the link. Well, thanks again, man. This has, been content rich. And just like, if this were a cheese, it would be a Limburger. I'm kidding. Or maybe a provolone, right? Like something that, that smells like your feet. How do I make it sound rich but pleasant at the same time?
It would taste like a nice cheddar cheese with tyrosine crystals. That is something you'll have to go onto the website to look up. Tyrosine, what is that? And for those who speak Greek, you'll know the etymology of that word.
Awesome, man. Well, thank you much. Good having you.
Have a good day.